Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. It's, hi, yes. My name is Brandon. I'm a member here, and I have been going through the book of Daniel. So if you have a Bible, there are Bibles scattered around. If you don't, you can probably grab one somewhere. You might have one on your phone or something like that. We're in the book of Daniel. We've been in the book of Daniel all summer. Actually, we started in the spring. And we're on Daniel 8 now. And if you remember the first half of the book, the first 6 chapters, we're talking about who is this Daniel, what did he go through, what were the challenges he went through, what ways was he tested, and how was he found faithful. They're court stories written in the Babylonian times and the Persian times, which showed trials that Daniel and the other Jewish young men went through and remained faithful to God, and how God was there for them. Talked about a lot about how Daniel was following God's word when he served Nebuchadnezzar, when he served Belshazzar, when he served these pagan tyrants. He was told, make their good your good. It's this backward sense of, yes, God is planning to destroy these kingdoms. God is planning to bring his kingdom above and beyond. But for the time being, as Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Serve those around you. Don't bring judgment upon yourself by what you approve, what you don't approve, things like that. We've gone through these things. And last week we talked about the first vision that Daniel receives in chapter 7. There's the second half of the book, 7 through 12, are the visions that Daniel receives. A lot of them are very troubling for him. We talked about how that vision that he received sort of really maps really well onto Nebuchadnezzar's dream from chapter 2. All of this really climaxes in the end of chapter 6. When Darius, the king of the Medes, says, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. This sense that God's kingdom is coming, God's kingdom is going to be established, God's kingdom will never end, God's reign will always and always be on top. This is what the book is summarizing, and so these visions that he's being given are in reference to that. So that gives the foundation of the prophecies we're about to go into. So now we're talking about chapter 8, and this is the second vision that Daniel receives. This is going to be 2 years after his first one. Just so you know, there's probably going to be about 2 more sermons after today. Even though we have 4 more chapters, I'm probably going to give 2 more sermons on Daniel, and then we're going to wrap it up. But I find this stuff fascinating, this stuff in chapter 8. And I hope you will too. I hope we'll look at it together and look at it together. Let's read the first 14 verses of chapter 8 together. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Olai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing at the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead, of it came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So this is the vision. We're going to get into the interpretation, which is going to be given a little bit here. But this is the vision that he's been given. Some of the vision will be explained, like I said. But I want to give you a heads up here that the general interpretation that I'm going to be using comes from biblical cues. It comes from the text itself. It comes from Jewish and Christian resources and understanding throughout the ages and things like that. But the main point I want to make today doesn't have to do with the exact interpretation of the text, although I will be doing stuff like that. What I really want to say is that you can disagree with my analysis of this or that thing. That's fine. The main point here is that this prophecy is useful to us. Even if it's used up, a used up prophecy is still useful. Sometimes we talk about how old prophecies, some people talk as if old prophecies that have already been fulfilled aren't useful, like there's no point in talking about them. But I think that's false. A fulfilled prophecy is in fact very valuable for us, and we'll talk about that. In the vision, he sees himself in Susa. So I want to give you some context here. That was the capital at the time of the Medes. It was 200 miles east of Babylon, which would be modern-day Western Iran today. The vision begins with this ram, which is interpreted for us a little bit later as the Medo-Persian Empire. It has one horn that's higher than the other, and this should bring to mind the bear from the last chapter, the wild beasts, the bear who was lifted up on one side versus the other. This is a parallelism that's going on in the text. It's just saying that even though there's the Medo-Persian Empire, they're not equal in power. There's this alliance between the Medes and the Persians and that they used to conquer the world, but the Persians were absolutely more dominant than the Medes. And this is just showing that the Persians would eventually swallow up the Medes before the end. They were dominant. And then comes this male goat. So we have this ram, and we have this male goat who comes in and smashes the ram to pieces. And this goat has this conspicuous horn on its head. And there's little doubt that this is the Greek Empire, just as been described in the last chapter, the Greek Empire, which comes after. And specifically, this conspicuous horn, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, the man who became general by the time he was 21, who had conquered the known world by the time he was 26. In 334 BC, Alexander's army met against the Persian forces. And as the story goes, Alexander's army was only about a third the size of the Persian army at that time. But he was able to slaughter 20,000 Persians, and his losses recorded only 100 men. Of course, there are so many historical issues with trying to understand Alexander the Great. There have been legends about him which have turned up in different civilizations because stories about him have spread and spread and spread. And so it's difficult to understand what's historical and what's exaggeration. But just get this, the legends grow out of the truth because he was an incredible military strategist, the most incredible one the world had seen to that time. So this conspicuous horn, however, is broken in verse 8. Alexander ended up being defeated by himself. He was too clever for his own good. His cleverness was his downfall. His military acumen was his downfall. He didn't know when to stop. He had so many successes in conquering, he wanted to push farther east, and finally, his soldiers just had enough. They refused to follow him. And then he retired to Babylon and then died soon after when he was 32 years old, probably a poisoning or an illness or something like that. It's not exactly known. Anyway, the point of this is to say that this is the pattern of war-hungry empires. They put so many resources into building the empire and spreading the empire and controlling others that they don't have enough energy or willpower to sustain it. So they end up being the fool who doesn't count the cost before building. They bankrupt and they exhaust themselves while spreading out, and then they end up worse than when they began. They don't have the resources to maintain what they've built. The large horn is broken up and replaced by four horns. We talked last week about the four dynasties, the four generals that took over Greece. This was mentioned in chapter 7. So this would be the four dynasties that come and rule Greece after Alexander died without naming a successor. And within those four horns comes a little horn. And I want to talk about this little horn quite a bit today because this little horn is talked in the scripture quite a bit as well. If you remember 2 weeks ago when we talked about chapter 7, there was a little horn that grew out of the fourth beast. Follow me here. There was a little horn that grew out of the fourth beast. But we know that the fourth beast was the Roman Empire. But now we're seeing a little horn growing out of the Greek Empire, which is just interesting, isn't it? That the same terminology is used in two different places to talk about two different things. We remember in the Roman Empire, it was the fact that it was the persecution of the saints of God that came from the rising up of the little horn, the trying to overthrow the saints of God. And here it's a very similar thing. According to Jewish and Christian commenters, this little horn is identified as Antiochus IV, or as he wanted to be known as he named himself, Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was a character. We should talk about him for a little bit today. So this vision says that he turned his attention to different places and then to the glorious land, which would be Jerusalem. And this is exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did. He went to the Holy Land. He went to Jerusalem, and there he persecuted the Jews of the 2nd century BC. He desecrated the Jewish temple. It says that in the text that he grew to the host of heaven. This is talking about his arrogance in challenging God's people. And the fact that he was able to throw down some of the host of heaven, it says here. It means that he was somewhat successful in his persecution of God's people for a period of time. He caused sacrifices in the temple to stop. This is historically accurate. 2 times every day in that temple, a burnt offering was supposed to be made to God. And he caused those sacrifices to stop. And then it says here that in verse 12, that he threw truth to the ground. He threw truth to the ground to be trampled on. This is the work of the little horn, to make war with the saints, to stop offerings being made in the temple, and to trample on the truth. And this vision concerned Daniel quite a bit. And he asks, how long is this desolation going to take place? He's told that he's asking, how long will this evil be allowed to survive? And lies being taken over and truth being toppled. This transgression that makes desolate. You know, Jesus would use this terminology and change it just a little bit in his talk of the destruction of the temple to talk about the abomination that causes desolation. These are not small issues that we're talking about here. This is the big deal. This would be allowed to go on for 2,300 evenings and mornings. And commentators say that this doesn't mean 2,300 days. It means about half that. Evenings and mornings, which is a little more than 3 years, which is the same amount of time that Antiochus controlled Jerusalem. The whole thing is recorded, by the way, in the history of the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which we have, a Jewish historical recording. This ability for the little horn to show up in 2 different empires gives us some clue about the nature of this little horn. It reminds me of sort of like a horror movie, where, like the horror movies from the 80s, if you remember, at the end, you think you've got it, but then it appears somewhere else, the beast, and then of course they want to make these sequels, and so you think you've defeated it, but then it shows up somewhere else. It manifests itself. It seems to be some sort of parasite. It attaches itself to some powerful host and wreaks as much havoc as it possibly can while it can. And then we're left wondering, well, if the horn can appear in the fourth beast and it can also appear in the male goat, is this little horn able to resurface in other places, in another worldly kingdom, perhaps in Germany, perhaps in North Korea or China or the United States? Is it possible for this parasite to take over and wreak havoc? I want to finish reading this chapter, which goes into the interpretation, real quick. Let's start in 15, and then we'll finish off here. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O man, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And by the way, he doesn't mean the end. He's talking about when is the end of this desolation. So this vision is for the time of the end of this desolation. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. So now he's done a part, he's unwound, he's completely terrified, and then he's also in a dead sleep with his face to the ground. This is quite a position he's in. All right, continuing. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms will arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without any warning he shall destroy many. He shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but not by human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. And then I rose up and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. He doesn't have the ability to look back in time like we do. He's completely undone by this vision. We're told that the first 2 animals are Persia and Greece, and it does seem clear that a late Greek ruler is the little horn. Antiochus Epiphanes gave himself that name, by the way. In fact, the name that he attempted to give himself was Theos Antiochus Epiphanes, which would mean Antiochus, the manifest God. He was so clearly insane that the early Christians called him Antiochus Epimanes, which I hear means Antiochus the lunatic, the madman. It says that he would be broken, but not by a human hand. I want to read a little bit from 2 Maccabees, if you'll let me, which talks about the downfall of this man before we sort of make our concluding points here. It's interesting because, well, let's just hear it. This is going to come from 2 Maccabees chapter 9, starting in about verse 4. The condemnation of heaven rode with him, because he said in his arrogance, I will make Jerusalem the common graveyard of Jews as soon as I arrive there. So the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him down with an incurable and invisible blow, for scarcely had he uttered those words when he was seized with excruciating pains in his bowels and sharp internal torment, a fit punishment for him who had tortured the bowels of others with many barbarous torments. Far from giving up his insolence, he was all the more filled with arrogance. Breathing fire in his rage against the Jews, he gave orders to drive even faster. As a result, he hurtled from the speeding chariot, and every part of his body was racked by the violent fall. Thus, he who previously in his superhuman presumption thought he could command the waves and the seas. By the way, our Lord does command the waves and the seas, but he presumed to be able to do so. And imagined he would weigh the mountaintops in the scales, was now thrown to the ground and had to be carried on a litter, clearly manifesting to all the power of God. The body of this impious man swarmed with worms, and while he was still alive in hideous torments, his flesh rotted off so that the entire army was sickened by the stench of his corruption. Shortly before, he had thought that he could reach the stars of heaven, and now no one could endure to transport the man because of his intolerable stench. At last, broken in spirit, he began to give up his excessive arrogance and to gain some understanding under the scourge of God, for he was racked with pain unceasingly. When he could no longer bear his own stench, he said, "It is right to be subject to God, and not to think of one's mortal self equal to God." That's just amazing. All the things this despicable person had to go through to get to this point where he's like, you know what? It's right not to consider yourself equal with God. This downfall of this leader was prophesied about hundreds of years before it happened. And I just want to make a couple of points about chapter 8 before finishing up. Some application here. If someone today were to take the elements of this chapter and write a report about it, or make a movie about it, or give some kind of write a book or something like that, what do you think they would emphasize in those historical facts? I think that 90% of what they would talk about would be Alexander the Great. I mean, how amazing his conquests, how incredible what he did. That stuff fascinates us. It really does. But if Antiochus was mentioned at all, and he might not even be mentioned, it would be a blip about the failings of a late leader of a failing empire, an empire in decline. And he's just not that interesting to us in general. But more than half this chapter is dedicated to talking about him. There's like a couple of sentences about Alexander the Great. I hope you see what I'm getting at here. The history of the world, the history that the world finds so important, is not the history that God finds important. God puts this little horn character front and center because this is a big deal to him. It reminds me of watching my kids play soccer with other kids. Alton plays soccer. He's getting really good at it, by the way. But if you imagine, if your kid's team is playing against another kid's team, and that other kid's team has a superstar who's going around working circles around your kid, working circles around everyone on the team, scoring goal after goal, you don't get upset with that amazing leader. That doesn't make you go, oh, I need to step in here. But if out in the corner, every time he can get away with it, there's a kid that keeps nudging your kid, pushing him down, trying to get elbows in and things like that, just because he can, that's where your attention goes. That's for me as a parent, that's what's going to make me enter the game. That's what's going to make me talk to the coach. That's what's going to get my eyes going. The little horn did something that the conspicuous horn didn't do. He messed with God's people. That's the concern of God, far greater than the concerns of the conquests of Alexander. God cherishes his people. He takes his covenants seriously, and his priorities are focused on his beloved. This should be encouraging for us. There are a lot of big players in the global political theater. A lot of power plays going on in the world. A lot of nations trying to come out on top, and a lot of leaders being financed by deep pockets. Lots of things that could be disconcerting for us. But the headlines of the New York Times are not the headlines concerning heaven. God is concerned with his people. The church is his greatest concern. And what matters in our lives is how we interact with God's people. It matters, even as children of God, that we care about those who God cares about. This is the message of Matthew 25. And as much as you did for me, as much as you did for the least of my brothers, you did it for me. It goes all the way back to God's covenant with Abraham. When God told him Those who bless you, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse. The New Testament tells us that anyone who is in Christ is a child of Abraham and also receives that blessing, that loving, tender care of the Father to him or her. And we are blessed when we care for those, the least of those in our church. Antiochus learned firsthand what it's like to see God's wrath. He moved into Jerusalem, killed the high priest, installed his own false high priest, killed 40,000 Jews in 3 days. He not only entered the Holy of Holies, which he did, he sacrificed pigs and human beings on the altar in the temple. He erected a statue of Zeus in the temple, and he forbade both circumcision and the observance of the Sabbath, punishable by death. He didn't die by human hands. He died by a grim display of God's judgment. His arrogance was his lunacy. Remember that all arrogance, all pride is lunacy. Look at Daniel here at the end, as we wrap up. Look at Daniel here at the very end. He's been given these troubling visions. He's told of the terrible evil which will soon enough come to God's people. And he sees a direct line from the king that he is currently serving, the tyrant king that he is under, to these little horns that will make war with the saints, and he never becomes jaded. He never turns cynical. Look at him there at the end of the chapter. Even with this gut-wrenching vision that he's given, he goes right back to his duty, serving the king of Babylon, rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's. Are you a child of God? If so, then God's concern is passionately for you. If there's any way at all this church can serve you, let us know. We're going to stand and sing a song. Let us know.